Good morning. I'm Carol Gay. As you probably know, this year I've had the privilege and challenge of being the board president here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. Today I'm here to share something of a state of the congregation with you. It's early 2021, almost a year after we closed our doors to keep us all safe from COVID. So where are we now? At this point, our building remains closed to congregational gatherings. We want this to change as soon as it's safe, and to that end, the board is working on our guiding principles to define how and when we feel it's safe to gather in person. In spite of not meeting in person, our congregation is still vibrant. Each Sunday we still have worship, adult RE classes are well attended, and forums broadcast fascinating panels to the wider community. Unfortunately, the youth in our YRE program have found virtual meetings to be one too many things in a year where much of their schooling has been virtual. Kudos to the YRE committee. They have not given up. Throughout the week, many of our small groups, from covenant groups to book groups, and all of our committees meet around the Zoom screen. And we've had some new and different offerings, like our weekly coffee chats, UUCC Zoom in Live, and virtual game nights. Of course, none of this is the same, but it's better than not meeting at all. As the weather warms, I suspect we'll start seeing groups with generously spaced lawn chairs on the church grounds. We're really fortunate. There's plenty of lawn for multiple groups to meet at the same time. Search. As you know, Reverend Joe is leaving UUCC at the end of June to pursue his next ministerial path. At the same time, our search committee is hard at work on the process of identifying a new minister for our congregation. The Lancashire building. Briefly, we have found a buyer for the Lancashire building, and while it could take up to a year for this to go through, it looks positive. For those who hold the Lancashire building dear, Reverend Joe will be holding a service honoring the place that building played in the life of the UU Society. This has been a good year for us to tackle some infrastructure projects, much of it in support of the strategic plan that our congregation approved at our 2020 annual meeting. Our recently formed marketing and communications teams, along with the membership committee, are working hard to get the word out about UUCC to the wider community, as well as making sure our current congregation gets the information they need at a time that they need it. UUCC remains on sound financial footing. Pledge income continues to come in, thank you all. Rental income is down due to limited use of the facilities, but at the same time, our expenses are also down for the same reason. Overall, we're doing okay. Last, sailing into 2021. Our stewardship committee has spent the last few months working on a stewardship campaign that will fund the 2021-2022 fiscal year from July 1st to June 30th. That campaign will kick off soon. Look for emails and videos and goodies dropped at your door. I've kept this brief. There's a fuller report that was sent via email and will be available soon on the website.
I light our chalice today, beacon of warmth, to remind us that no matter where we come from, no matter who we love, no matter where we are in the world today, we can be loved and be loving. Hi, I'm Reverend Joe Cherry of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland, and I'd like to welcome you to our worship. Today we're focusing on the story and the stories of folks around the Underground Railroad. So there'll be some music by Karin, Tooley, a reflection by Allan, our Director of Religious Education, about virtue signaling, and I'm going to talk about what it might have been like to take the journey. It's a complicated thing for a largely white-looking group of folks to talk about Black History and Black History Month, and I hope that we've done it in a way that's respectful and shows our care, if not perfection. So, having said that, please join us for worship.
Come share a rose with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you home when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter tide.
Please join us in our Unison Reading by Harriet Tubman. I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other.
So I have to wonder if my grandfather actually watched this exact video. It's remarkable to see something so true to life from this period in history. I mean, an instructional video for Navy flag signalmen. And now, of course, you can just look it up on YouTube. The whole idea of that seems so distant somehow in 2021. But that's actually what my grandfather did during World War II. He was on a naval cruiser, and he was the Sema-Phore signaler. If you don't know, Sema-Phore is a kind of alphabet. It defines letters in the alphabet with different hand positions so that messages can be communicated at long distance visually by somebody somewhere else using binoculars. When it was initially invented, it used giant wooden structures that were built all over the French countryside so that the message could be sent from, let's say, Lyon to Paris. With just like a dozen or so such contraptions, and of course some very good binoculars, you could get a few sentences across even a few hundred miles. At the time, it was the only way to communicate long distance. But can you imagine doing the same thing, except with a person and some flags, on a gigantic naval ship during a war? I mean, the idea is so crazy. But apparently it's what my grandfather and his lanky, tall frame was trained to do, and so he spent the war signaling his heart out. And other than one story about him missing a ship in Naples, it seemed that he managed through the war without any spectacular issues. And he returned home with, I assume, some flag souvenirs. So by contrast, consider how easy it is to communicate in 2021. I mean, I can literally pick up my cell phone and literally just making some motions over a flat screen, because now, living in the future, we literally have gotten rid of buttons even. I can, in almost no time at all, send a text message to Japan without any effort at all. And what's more, I can actually make it as long as I'd like it to be. And I can say pretty much whatever it is that I want. You know, my grandfather, by contrast, was risking life and limb, you know, in wartime conditions, flapping his arms around in the air, desperately trying to tell some other ship in the shortest possible space about wind direction and vectors and, you know, whatever else it was he was trying to say. Meanwhile, I can download gigabytes of content on my phone watching a movie while I'm, you know, eating cereal for breakfast. So it's interesting to think about just how easy it's become to send signals. And I think that's a big deal because now we're also sending signals in all kinds of ways about all kinds of things, sometimes even when we're not aware of it. So suppose, for example, that you're kind of a person who cares about progressive issues in society, and so you find yourself attending a UU church. You might voice support for programs and initiatives that you believe in by talking about them on social media. You might even make sure that you put the right kinds of voting signs in your yard to make sure that the issues and concerns that you care about are signaled to your neighbors and community. You might even go so far as to make sure that you have the right kind of bumper sticker on your car. That's a very specific kind of a signal. So all of these are very intentional ways in which we are communicating to the world in a way that is so simple and so straightforward and so easy for us to do. I mean, consider it. You don't have to stand on the prow of a boat. You don't even have to, wave your arms in the air at all. At the same time, the way that we signal, even sometimes, those are intentional examples, but sometimes even unintentionally, it's become part of the world now in a different way, because also now we are so often trying to hear and listen for those signals in all kinds of ways. And so perhaps even part of it is outside of our control. But I think that as a result of that, there's a lesson we can really learn from the effort and the risk and the intentionality of trying to get a signal through by waving flags and signaling to other ships. And that is, if you go through the effort of sending a signal, you have to be ready to follow through. So if you tell the world, for example, that you are a trans ally, you have to be ready to show up when it matters. At the same time, if you're serious about doing anti-racism work, and you are serious about bringing a concern for anti-racist policies into our social landscape, you cannot send those signals until you are ready to, drawing on that analogy, set your engines to full and really go where you say you're going to go. It's interesting because, again, it's so easy now to put an image on a Facebook profile. It's so simple to just add a hashtag to social media or knock a yard sign into the lawn. But making sure that your boat turns when you say it's going to turn, making sure that your life lives up to your signals, that takes commitment and integrity. And to be you is to consider your life through the standpoint of values that direct and inform and guide your way forward in the world. And so a thing for us to really take seriously is that if we don't make sure that those values inform both the signal side and the action side, then our signals will stop being signals at all, and they just become meaningless noise.
Dear Tim and Moby, what can you tell me about the Underground Railroad? Your friend, Bo. Hey, Bo. The Underground Railroad wasn't a subway or anything like that. It was a network of escape routes and hideouts set up during the 19th century. African Americans used it to flee the slave-holding states of the South. The underground part meant that they traveled in complete secrecy. And railroad came from the code language they used in communications, like conductors for the people who helped runaways escape, passengers or baggage for those who were fleeing slavery, and stations for the homes and other places where they'd hide. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children escaped to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Most settled in northern states and Canada, while some went west or farther south. Life wasn't easy in a lot of these places. Runaways faced racism just about everywhere they settled, but they had gained their freedom. Some joined groups of abolitionists, people committed to ending slavery. The Quakers, a Christian organization, were some of the earliest abolitionists. One of their central beliefs is that all people are equal. I know, but back in the 1800s, that was a pretty radical idea. It took a broad range of people to get support for the abolitionist cause. Like Frederick Douglass, who'd escaped slavery as a young man. He wrote and spoke with passion about the cruelty of owning human beings. Sojourner Truth, once enslaved herself, was another fearless crusader. When someone threatened to burn down a hall where she was scheduled to talk, she replied, "Then I will speak upon the ashes." White abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Ward Beecher were equally passionate. And religious groups besides the Quakers got involved too. All of these people worked tirelessly to end slavery and help runaways build new lives. As the abolitionist movement grew, the Underground Railroad picked up steam. Routes expanded, and new ones opened up heading to Mexico and the Caribbean. The path to freedom often meant going long distances by foot, carrying everything you owned. But people also had to stow away on boats, wagons, and trains. Whatever it took to escape a life of slavery. One man, Henry Box Brown, even shipped himself from Virginia to Pennsylvania. An abolitionist shop owner helped him hide in a wooden cargo box. He spent over a day inside before it was safely reopened in Philadelphia. The journey wasn't easy for anyone and could stretch over 1,000 miles. Passengers avoided main roads and traveled mostly at night. They often had to duck into swamps or forests to avoid being seen and captured. Those who helped them were also at risk. You could be thrown in jail for giving runaways food or shelter. Despite the danger, some folks took on even bigger roles in the Underground Railroad. They personally guided passengers between stations, taking them from one stop to the next. These were the railroad's conductors. The majority were African Americans already living freely in the North. Harriet Tubman is the most well-known. She was born into slavery in Maryland, but escaped to Pennsylvania when she was a young woman. Tubman helped more than 100 people make it north. Another important conductor was William Still. He kept detailed records of the nearly 650 people he helped save. Still used these stories to publish a book about their experiences. That's one reason we know so much about the Underground Railroad. No, slave owners weren't too happy about losing the people they viewed as their property. They resented Northerners for interfering in their business, and were especially outraged at states that protected runaways. Federal regulations said that any escapees had to be returned. In the eyes of the law, they were like stolen property. But several states passed laws making it illegal to arrest them. Other states gave runaways the right to jury trials and free legal help. Often, juries would refuse to convict, and the men and women would go free. So Southerners pushed the federal government to pass the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Anyone in law enforcement who didn't arrest a runaway would have to pay a big fine, and people who sheltered or helped them could be imprisoned. The law infuriated Northern abolitionists. Most continued to help African Americans make it to Canada, even though they now faced serious consequences. The slavery issue ripped the country apart, dividing North and South. In Kansas, the dispute spilled over into armed combat, and in 1861, the conflict finally exploded into the Civil War. You can learn more about that in our Civil War Causes movie. Hey, here's our train. You may want to stand aside. Because, that.
Please join us in our Unison Reading by Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not lead single-issue lives. Our struggles are particular, but we are not alone. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities.
Each week we come together as a people. Together we share stories, love, aspiration. We also share our bounty in ways that express our religious UU values. May this important ritual of sharing abundance remind us that making our world better is a task best shared.
Our reading from the Global Scripture this morning is from a Slate article called Pages from an Underground Railroad Conductor's Diary, Preserve Fugitive Slave Stories. William Still, Philadelphian, and son of a formerly enslaved woman who had escaped to freedom before his birth, was a prominent conductor on the Underground Railroad. Starting in 1852, Still recorded details about each fugitive he encountered, writing down names, ages, skills, status of family members, names of slave owners, and conditions of enslavement. Here are just 3 entries from June 22, 1855. William is about 40, dark, chestnut, medium-sized, very intelligent, member of the Methodist Church under the charge of Reverend Mr. Jones. His owner's name was Turner and Whitehead, with whom he had served for 20 years in the capacity of packer. He had been treated with mildness in some respects, though though had been very tightly worked, allowed only $1.50 per week to board and clothe himself and family upon. Consequently, he was obliged to make up the balance as he could. Had been sold once, one sister had been sold also. He was prompted to escape because he wanted his liberty, was not satisfied with not having the privilege of providing for his family. His value, $1,000, paid $240 for himself, wife, and child, and Mrs. Bell. Susan is about 30, dark, rather above medium size, well-made, good-looking, intelligent, and a member of the same church to which her husband belonged. Was owned by Thomas Bottomore, with whom she had lived for 7 years. Her treatment, a part of the time, had been mild. The marriage of her master, however, made a change. Afterward, she had been treated badly. Her master, to gratify his wife, constantly threatening to sell her. 4 of her sisters had been sold away to parts unknown years ago. Left, father and mother, 3 brothers, and 1 sister still in Virginia, living about 100 miles from Norfolk. $1,000 was the demand of the owner for Susan and her child, 22 months old. Louisa Ball is the wife of a free man, is about 28, chestnut color, good-looking, intelligent, genteel, and a member of no church. Was owned by L. Stassen, confectioner. Her lot had been terrible on account of the continual threats to sell her. Had once been sold. Had also had 5 sisters sold beside her mother. Louisa was obliged to leave 2 of her children behind, a boy 6 years and a girl 2.5 years. The boy's name was Robert and the girl's Mary. Her husband, James Bell, is to come on.
The other day, I was down at Edgewater Beach looking over this great lake of ours, Erie, and it got me thinking about our geography and how excited I was to move to Ohio, another state that borders Canada, and about paying respects to Black History Month. Now, you know that I'm a bit of a history buff. As I considered what I might talk about today, this transrelational relationship between Canada and the United States was, of course, central on my mind, looking as I was across the water. And that was all prompted by our place on the map. Ohio and Ontario are neighbors, and we have more in common than just Lake Erie. It was the shared history of people all around the shores of Lake Erie that brought me to the topic of the Underground Railroad. We have a wonderful shared history of people inspired by their faith and a desire for freedom, a shared story in the Underground Railroad. Now, when I first came here, I stopped and saw several of the places, being the history person that I am. But now it seems to be a good time to talk about it because most students in the United States learn at least a little something about the railroad. We learn that Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave who helped hundreds of others escape to freedom. We learn about the Fugitive Slave Act and the need for freed slaves to go north. We know they often went to Ohio, to my home state, Michigan, and then on to Canada. And that's kind of where our knowledge about things ends, at the border, at the water. The thing is, history is often like this. We learn the part of the story that is most germane to us, and the rest just sort of fades away. But of course, people came to the shores of Ontario and set up lives for themselves. Harriet Tubman herself had a home in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the 1850s. On a trip as volunteers with some senior citizens out of Port Huron, Michigan, my mom and dad visited the Tubman house in St. Catharines, And when I told my mom about this morning's sermon, she recalled her trip very fondly and remembered being very impressed with the site when they went for a visit. Of course, the story doesn't go just one way. No, it's not like the story of people fleeing slavery and then landing north in the slave shores of Ontario just stopped there. One of the greatest tools of the American efforts at abolition of slavery was inspired by a man living in Dresden, Ontario, a man named Josiah Henson. Mr. Henson met a Unitarian woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe met Mr. Henson in Andover, Massachusetts, in her home. Inspired by both Mr. Henson's story and the way her own Unitarian faith called her to work for the abolition of slavery, Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. When her book was released, Mr. Henson wrote this about the book. When this novel of Mrs. Stowe came out, it shook the foundations of this world. It shook the Americans out of their shoes and out of their shirts. It left some of them on the sandbar, barefooted and scratching their heads. So they came to the conclusion that the whole thing was a fabrication. Mr. Henson met with Mrs. Stowe on one of his trips back to the United States in the service of abolition and of freeing individual people from the evils of slavery. Mr. Henson made dangerous returns to the States, guiding 118 others to freedom in his life. Mr. Henson, with the aid of Samuel Atkins Eliot, penned his own autobiography, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. It was published in 1849, 2 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin. Samuel Atkins Eliot would be, in his lifetime, both the mayor of the city of Boston, and at one point he became a representative for Massachusetts in Washington. He came from a prominent family, and his grandson, the Reverend Samuel Eliot, served the American Unitarian Association from 1898 to 1927 as its president. Now, not all the Unitarians in this story were on the leading or proper edge of history in this question of slavery in the United States. I'm quite sorry to report that President Millard Fillmore, in what could be called a flawed attempt to preserve the Union of the United States, signed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which allowed bounty hunters to pursue escaped people up north, up into the free states, and to be returned to the slave states. The bounty hunters, as you might imagine, and not so surprisingly, were often more interested in profit than ethics. And there are many tales of free blacks being erroneously returned to slavery. Solomon Northrum's book, 12 Years a Slave from 1853, made into a movie in 2013, is just one example of this appalling reality. There are, of course, many other stories that never got told. And since we're in Ohio, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention John Brown. John Brown, of course, was an abolitionist, sent, he felt, quote, by God to strike down the unholy institution of slavery, end quote. While Brown was not born in Ohio, but Connecticut, he grew up in the little town of Hudson. Recently, Denny and I visited Hudson a couple weeks ago because it's so close to where we live. There we discovered an historical plaque, and I can't pass those up, where it pointed out where it was in Hudson at the Congregational Church that Brown made his public declaration about his war on slavery during a meeting. John's father, Owen Brown, was a leading figure in Hudson and operated a station on the Underground Railroad himself. John Brown's attack at Harper's Ferry is often cited as one of the catalysts for the secession of the southern states and thereby the creation of two Americas, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. In essence, for a time, those traveling along the Underground Railroad had to pass through three sovereign nations to get to freedom. This morning, I requested that Karin play the song Follow the Drinkin' Gourd because it's just one example of songs that were used to guide people along the Underground Railroad to freedom. According to some scholars, the song contains directions for escape from the deep south up to at least Ohio and probably into Canada. Here are some of the lyrics. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Now, sometimes the old man is the river, of course. Now, the river bank makes a mighty good road, and the dead trees will show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on, follow the drinking gourd. Now the river ends between two hills. Follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side. So follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. The old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Without diving too deeply into the lyrics of the song or exegeting them ad nauseum, I'll say this: the song teaches those who know it when the best time to leave the plantation is. When the first quail calls is in the springtime. The riverbank refers to the Tombigbee River, which leads from northern Mississippi. Markings left on dead trees by a man named Peg Leg Joe helped you find your way, and the river ending in between two hills are directions to our very own Ohio River. Once over the river, an escaping slave was, until the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, safe. Along the way, you would follow the drinking gourd, which is another name for the Big Dipper, which points you north to freedom, to Canada, which in a way returns me back to Upper Canada, or as it's called today, Ontario. In Ontario, several communities of former slaves thrived. Places like Amherstburg, Chatham, London, Oro, Woolwich, and Windsor. Others crossed the Great Lakes to freedom and made their homes near Owen Sound and in Toronto. In each of these stories, some more famous than others, the people involved in the Underground Railroad, people's understanding of God called them to duty. Some of the histories have only captured a snippet of a whole life. Earlier Peg read just 3 entries of people that were helped along the Underground Railroad by Mr. William Still. Mr. Still was determined to tell the stories of the people who, to quote him, had the determination toward liberty, even at the cost of life. It would be hard, I think, if not impossible, for many of us to dream, to really imagine the kind of faith it would take to run away from the only home we may have ever known, even though it be an unhappy home, Not just that, but into the dark of night and into the unknown and in many ways unknowable. To know that you would need to hide from slave catchers, to know that you would need to find food along the way, to know that there was really no established path, no paved or marked roads for you to follow. I believe it's impossible for us to today, at least most of us listening to this sermon, to imagine what making a choice like that, a choice to leave, must have been like. It took courage and, I'm sure, desperation, and I've no doubt it took faith. Faith that there could be help along the way. Faith that you would find people willing to feed you, to help you, to shelter you, or at the very least, to turn a blind eye to you as you made your way to freedom. All through places you've never been. I'd like to invite you to imagine for a moment contemplating escaping on such an unknown journey of some 780 miles. That is the distance between Montgomery, Alabama and Cleveland, Ohio. Imagine facing such a dangerous journey. It's a journey few of us would contemplate even in the best of times. And yet, even today, there are refugees worldwide who are forced into this kind of decision. And yet the journey is and was undertaken. More often than not, it is not completed successfully. Heartbreakingly often, this is the story. But sometimes the journey was completed, and with great joy. Families reunited, new families created, and generations to follow. All of these journeys, those that reach the goal of freedom and those who are not able to, were assisted by the faith of people. The individual who was bold enough to begin had to have faith. The people of the Underground Railroad, the conductors, the station masters, those providing safe houses and depots, each of them working by what they understood to be the moral path, each of these moral paths taught to them by their faiths. Their differing faiths, different ways of expressing in their faith. When we consider our actions today, when we think about the meetings that we go to, or the protests, or the rallies, when we hold vigils, or deep and sometimes uncomfortable conversations in the service, we hope, of creating a world more just and more fair for all, a world of possibilities for the children that we love, biological or not, we are tapping into the same well of faith, even if it be called by different names. This is how humanity slowly, unsteadily, but surely advances, ever relying upon each other, ever inspiring one another. May our mutual admiration, affection, and effort truly transform our world. My final question to you today is this: what risks does your faith call you to take? As we prepare to leave our time together, let us remember that Black history is not confined, should not be confined to 1 month of the year. It should be integrated into our whole lives, our whole selves, our whole calendar. the story of the people who have led from slavery, who are part of the Afro diaspora, no matter where they came from, is an important story, and let us never forget to remember them in the context of our whole culture.
My brother